The GPS died somewhere around mile marker 43, leaving me with nothing but Dan's scrawled directions and the growing certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake. When the headlights finally caught the faded sign for Crossroads Diner, I almost drove past it. The building looked like something that had been forgotten by time and left to rot in the Minnesota wilderness. I pulled into the gravel lot, my Honda crunching over stones and broken glass. The diner squatted under a single flickering streetlight, its aluminum siding stained with rust and years of neglect. Through the windows I could see harsh fluorescent lighting that made everything inside look sickly and overexposed. 20 miles from Grand Rapids, surrounded by nothing but pine trees and the kind of darkness that swallows sound. This was where I'd be spending my nights for the foreseeable future. The bell above the door gave a tired chime when I pushed inside. The smell hit me immediately. Old grease, burnt coffee, and something else I couldn't identify. Something stale and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. "You must be Opal." I turned to find a man emerging from behind the counter. Maybe mid-30s with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of neat appearance that suggested he took his job seriously. His handshake was firm, professional. Dan Graves, day manager. He gestured around the empty diner. "Welcome to the Crossroads." The interior looked exactly like every dying roadside diner in America. Cracked vinyl booths in faded red, a long counter with swivel stools, and fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects. The linoleum floor had been mopped so many times the pattern was nearly gone, and the walls were decorated with the kind of generic Americana you could buy in bulk. Old license plates, vintage Coca-Cola signs, a clock shaped like a coffee cup. "Not much to look at," Dan said, following my gaze, "but it serves its purpose." He walked me through the basics with methodical precision. Coffee maker, ancient but functional. Register, older than me, but it worked. Order system, simple enough that a trained monkey could handle it. The kitchen was small and efficient, everything within arm's reach of the grill and fryer. "Most of your customers will be truckers," Dan explained as we returned to the front. "Coffee, maybe a burger or pie. Nothing complicated. The overnight shift is usually pretty quiet." "Usually?" Something flickered across his face, too quick to interpret. "Well, it's the middle of nowhere. Not exactly a hot spot for nightlife." Around midnight, the bell chimed again. A woman walked in, late 20s maybe, with long black hair pulled back in a severe braid. She moved with the kind of economy that suggested she'd done this exact routine 1,000 times before. "Heather Marquez," Dan said quietly. "She'll be working with you." Heather nodded in my direction, barely acknowledgement, before disappearing into the kitchen without a word. I heard the soft sounds of someone checking equipment, opening and closing drawers with practiced efficiency. "She's been here 3 years, Dan said, adjusting his glasses. "Keeps to herself, but she knows the job better than anyone. If you need help with anything, ask her." Something in his tone suggested I probably wouldn't get much of a response if I did. Dan gathered his things, a thermos, a small notebook, his jacket. At the door, he paused and reached into his shirt pocket, pulling out a laminated card about the size of an index card. "Almost forgot." He handed it to me. "Read this. Follow it exactly." I glanced down at the card. 6 numbered items in courier font, like someone had typed them on an old typewriter. "Do not look up when the bell rings at 1:50 a.m. If an elderly man orders coffee and a glazed donut at 3:30 a.m., serve him with your eyes on his face. Do not look at his left hand. At 3:55 a.m., if you hear sounds from the kitchen, stand by the front entrance until 4:21 a.m. If anyone asks for a cheeseburger with no onions between 4:40 and 4:50 a.m., tell them you cannot make that order and ask them to leave. Do not serve anyone wearing a sundress after 4 a.m., regardless of the weather. If the bell rings at 4:52 a.m., call the number written on the back of this card immediately." I looked up at Dan, waiting for the punchline. Seriously? His expression didn't change. Follow them exactly, Opal. Don't deviate. Don't make exceptions. Don't think you know better. This is hazing, right? Mess with the new girl? Dan stepped closer, and for the first time since I'd met him, his careful composure cracked slightly. I need you to understand something. This isn't a joke. These rules exist for a reason, and that reason is keeping you safe. Promise me you'll follow them. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the kitchen, Heather was moving around with those same efficient, practiced motions. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows like something alive. Okay, I said, though I still didn't believe him. I'll follow your weird rules. Dan nodded, but he didn't look relieved. Good. I'll see you tomorrow night. After he left, I tucked the card under the register and tried to focus on the normal parts of the job. The coffee was strong enough to dissolve paint. The pie case held exactly 3 slices, apple, cherry, and something that might have been chocolate cream. The register had the kind of mechanical keys that required actual effort to press. Over the next few hours, I served exactly 4 customers. 2 truckers who wanted coffee and directions, an older woman who ordered pie and left a $1 tip, and a guy who looked like he hadn't slept in days and paid for his meal in crumpled singles. Normal people doing normal things in a normal diner. By 1 in the morning, I'd almost forgotten about Dan's ridiculous rules. The card sat under the register like a piece of elaborate performance art. 6 impossible instructions for dealing with customers who would never come. I mean, who orders a cheeseburger with no onions at 4:45 in the morning? And what kind of person wears a sundress after 4 a.m. in Minnesota in October? The whole thing was obviously some kind of initiation ritual designed to see how gullible the new employee was. Well, joke was on them. I might be desperate enough to take a job in the middle of nowhere, but I wasn't stupid enough to fall for amateur hour pranks. I pulled the card out and read through it again, shaking my head at the absurdity. Tomorrow night, I'd ask Dan what the real rules were. Tonight, I'd just focus on learning the actual job. The clock above the coffee maker ticked toward 2 a.m., and the diner settled into the kind of deep quiet that only comes in the small hours. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like distant conversation. Just me, Heather in the kitchen, and the long stretch of night ahead. The clock above the coffee maker read 1:50 a.m. when I heard the bell chime. I looked up automatically, already forming the greeting on my lips. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a faded denim jacket that looked like it had seen better decades. The fluorescent lights caught his face as he stepped inside, and something about his smile made my stomach clench. Too wide. Way too wide. Like someone had described what a smile should look like to someone who'd never seen one. "Evening," he said, and his voice sounded normal enough. Pleasant, even. "This the Crossroads Diner?" "Yes, it is." The words came out steady, professional. "Just you tonight?" He laughed, a sound that went on a beat too long. "Been driving for hours looking for this place. You'd think it would be easier to find, wouldn't you?" I grabbed a menu from the stack, but he waved it away. Instead of sitting, he leaned against the counter, studying me with eyes that never seemed to blink. Not once. "How long's this place been here?" he asked. "I'm not sure. I just started working here." I tried to keep my voice light. "Can I get you some coffee? We've got fresh pie." "Just started, huh?" He tilted his head, and that smile stretched even wider. "You know where here really is?" The question hit me wrong, like a note played off key. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you know where you are right now? Really know?" He leaned closer, and I caught a whiff of something that reminded me of wet leaves and old pennies. Because I've been driving these roads for a long time in this place, it's not always where it should be. My hand found the edge of the counter, gripping it tight. The clock read 1:53 a.m. now. and something cold was spreading through my chest. The first rule: don't look up when the bell rings at 1:50 a.m. But I had looked up. I'd looked right at him. "You worked here long?" he continued, as if we were having the most normal conversation in the world. His eyes, God, those eyes, stayed fixed on mine without blinking. Must get lonely. All the way out here in the middle of nowhere. "Not really," I managed. "We get plenty of customers." "Do you now?" Another laugh. "What kind of customers come to a place like this? Regular folks or something else?" The coffee maker gurgled behind me, suddenly loud in the silence. I needed to take his order, get him served, get him out. That's how this worked. That's how normal worked. "What can I get you to eat?" I tried again. "You alone tonight?" he asked instead, ignoring my question completely. "Just you and whoever's hiding in that kitchen?" My blood went cold. He knew about Heather. How could he know about Heather? "I can make you a burger, or we have pie." "Answer my question." The smile never wavered, but his voice dropped lower. "Are you alone?" I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could form the words, the kitchen door burst open. Heather appeared like she'd been shot from a cannon, her dark eyes taking in the scene in one quick sweep. When she saw the man at the counter, her face went completely white. "Kitchen. Now." She grabbed my arm with fingers that felt like steel cables. "Move." But "Now, Opal." Something in her voice cut through my confusion. I let her pull me backward toward the kitchen, the man's too wide smile following us the whole way. As we reached the swinging doors, I heard him call out cheerfully, "Nice meeting you, Opal. I'm sure I'll see you again real soon." Heather shoved me through the doors and slammed them shut behind us, her hand shaking as she turned the lock. Through the small window in the door, we could see him standing at the counter, perfectly still, not moving, not even seeming to breathe. Just standing there with that horrible smile stretched across his face. "Jesus Christ," Heather whispered, pressing her back against the door. "You looked at him. You actually looked at him." What was I supposed to do? He was a customer. He wasn't a customer. Her voice was sharp, cutting. "And you know it. Deep down, you know it." I stared through the window at the man who hadn't moved a muscle in the past 3 minutes. "The rules," I said quietly. "The first rule: don't look up when the bell rings at 1:50 a.m. Heather's breathing was starting to slow, but her knuckles were still white where she gripped the door handle. "You looked up." "I didn't know." "That's why the rules exist. So you don't have to know. So you just follow them and stay safe." The man at the counter turned his head toward the kitchen door. Even through the small window, I could see that smile, those unblinking eyes. He raised one hand and waved at us, a slow, deliberate gesture. "How long does he stay?" I whispered. 15 minutes. Always 15 minutes. Heather checked her watch. "Started at 1:50, so he'll leave at 2:05. And then what?" Then we pretend it never happened. We stood there in the harsh kitchen lighting, watching the thing that looked like a man stand motionless at our counter. The minutes crawled by with the weight of hours. At exactly 2:04, he turned toward the door. But instead of walking forward, he moved backward, his body somehow gliding in reverse without turning around. The bell chimed once as he passed through the doorway, and then he was gone. Heather unlocked the door and pushed it open carefully, scanning the empty diner. "Clear." I followed her out on unsteady legs. The counter looked normal. No sign that anything had happened. Even the air smelled right again. Just old grease and burnt coffee. "You're lucky," Heather said, wiping down the counter with quick, efficient strokes. "Some people who break the first rule don't get a second chance." "What would have happened if you hadn't come out?" She paused in her cleaning, the rag still in her hands. "I don't know. No one's ever stuck around to find out." I pulled the laminated card from under the register, staring at the first rule. The words looked different now, heavier somehow. How did you know? You were in the kitchen. I always know when it's 1:50. Heather resumed cleaning, but her movements were more careful now, like she was trying not to make any sudden noises. You learn to feel it after a while. The air changes, gets thicker. This is insane. Yeah. She tossed the rag into the sink. But it's also your job. Dan told you to follow the rules. I'm telling you to follow the rules. Next time, don't look up. Next time. Heather's laugh was short and bitter. Oh, there's always a next time. That's the thing about this place. It keeps testing you. Keeps pushing to see how far you'll bend before you break. I looked around the diner, seeing it differently now. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a more ominous tone. Even the vintage decorations on the walls looked less like nostalgic charm and more like a facade hiding something darker underneath. Why do you stay? I asked. Heather was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the empty parking lot. Same reason you will, she said finally. Because once you've seen it, once you know it's real, everything else feels like pretending. The rest of the shift passed without incident. A few truckers stopped for coffee and directions. A woman in scrubs, probably getting off a late shift at the hospital, ordered pie and left a decent tip. Normal people doing normal things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that normal was just another word for lucky. When Dan arrived at 6 a.m. to relieve us, he took one look at my face and sighed. The first rule? I nodded. But you're still here. Heather pulled me into the kitchen. Dan glanced at Heather, who was already gathering her things. Thank you. She shrugged. She'll learn, or she won't. After she left, Dan poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from me at the counter. How do you feel? Like I'm losing my mind. That's normal. The first few encounters are always the hardest. He sipped his coffee, studying me over the rim. You could quit. Walk away right now. Pretend this never happened. Could I? Really? Dan was quiet for a moment. Probably. You haven't been here long enough for it to stick, but once you've seen a few more, once you've really adapted. He trailed off. What happens then? Then you become like us, and leaving stops being an option. I thought about Heather's words, about how everything else would feel like pretending, about my student loans and my mother's medical bills and the crushing weight of having no other choices. I'll see you tonight, I said. Dan nodded slowly. Yeah, I figured you would. I drove home through the morning light, the normal world looking strangely fragile around me. Like it was all just a thin veneer over something much stranger and more dangerous. The rules card sat in my passenger seat, 6 impossible instructions that had suddenly become the most important thing I owned. The clock crawled toward 3:30 a.m. like it was moving through molasses. I'd served 3 truckers in the past hour, each interaction feeling surreal after what had happened at 1:50. Every time the bell chimed, my heart jumped. Every customer who walked through that door looked wrong somehow, even when they were obviously just tired drivers wanting coffee and directions. I kept pulling out the rule card, reading it over and over. Rule 2. If an elderly man orders coffee and a glazed donut at 3:30 a.m., serve him with your eyes on his face. Do not look at his left hand. The specificity of it made my skin crawl. Not just any elderly man, not just any time. 3:30 a.m. exactly, coffee and a glazed donut exactly, like someone had watched this exact scenario play out before and written instructions for surviving it. At 3:29, I positioned myself behind the counter, hands flat on the surface to keep them from shaking. The coffee was fresh. The glazed donut sat alone in the display case like it had been waiting. The bell chimed at exactly 3:30. An elderly man shuffled through the door and my stomach dropped to my shoes. Brown cardigan that looked like it belonged in a 1970s catalog. thick glasses that magnified his eyes until they seemed too large for his face, thinning white hair combed carefully over a spotted scalp. He moved slowly, deliberately, like every step required conscious effort. When he reached the counter, he smiled at me with the kind of gentle expression that belonged on someone's grandfather. "Good morning, dear," he said, his voice soft and papery. "Could I get a cup of black coffee and one of those glazed donuts?" The words hit me like ice water, exactly what the rule had predicted, down to the phrasing. "Of course." I kept my voice steady, professional. "Coming right up." I poured the coffee with careful precision, watching his face the entire time. He had kind eyes behind those thick lenses, crow's feet that spoke of decades of smiling, a small mole on his left cheek, a hearing aid barely visible in his right ear. Normal. Completely, utterly normal. I set the coffee in front of him and used the tongs to transfer the glazed donut to a small plate. He nodded approvingly, pulling out a worn leather wallet with his right hand. "How much do I owe you, dear?" $3.50. He opened the wallet and began counting out exact change with methodical care. $1 bill, another dollar, 2 quarters. The movements were slow, arthritic, the kind of careful counting that comes with age and fixed incomes. I kept my eyes locked on his face, just like the rule said, watched him concentrate on the bills and coins. Noticed how his tongue poked out slightly as he focused, the way my grandmother used to do when she was working on a crossword puzzle. He placed the money on the counter with his right hand, coins stacked neatly on top of the bills. "There you go." I reached for the money, and that's when I saw it. Movement in my peripheral vision, his left hand resting on the counter beside the payment. Don't look. The rule was crystal clear. Do not look at his left hand. But peripheral vision doesn't require looking directly. And what I could see at the edge of my sight made my breath catch in my throat. The skin was moving, shifting, like wax melting under heat, but slowly, deliberately. The flesh seemed to be dripping away from whatever lay underneath, revealing glimpses of something dark and glistening. I jerked backward, my elbow catching the coffee pot behind me. It crashed to the floor in an explosion of glass and hot coffee, the sound echoing through the empty diner like a gunshot. The elderly man tilted his head, those magnified eyes studying me with sudden interest. "Did you see something interesting, dear?" His voice was still soft, still grandfatherly, but there was something else underneath it now. Something that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward toward the kitchen, not trusting myself to speak. The old man sat perfectly still, watching me with that gentle smile. His right hand held the coffee cup in a normal human grip. His left hand, I couldn't help it. I glanced down. The skin had peeled back entirely now, revealing something that wasn't bone or muscle or anything that should exist inside a human body. Something that moved with its own rhythm, dark and wet and wrong. "Oh," he said quietly. "You looked." I ran. The kitchen door slammed behind me with enough force to rattle the walls. I pressed my back against it, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Through the small window I could see him sitting calmly at the counter, taking small, measured sips of his coffee, with his right hand. His perfectly normal, perfectly human right hand. His left hand continued its slow dissolution on the counter, the flesh reforming and melting in an endless cycle. But he paid it no attention, just sat there eating his glazed donut like nothing was happening. The clock above the prep station read 3:37. 3 more minutes. Just 3 more minutes and he'd leave, just like the man in the denim jacket had left. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, knees pulled up to my chest. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps that I couldn't seem to control. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, too bright, too harsh. This was real. This was actually happening. Through the window, I watched him finish the donut with careful bites. dabbing at his mouth with a napkin between each one. The picture of elderly politeness. If I could just focus on his face, on his normal right hand, I could almost pretend everything was fine. But that thing where his left hand should be kept moving, kept changing, kept being wrong in ways that made my brain hurt to process. At exactly 3:40, he stood up. He left the exact change on the counter, picked up his napkin, and walked toward the door with that same careful, arthritic shuffle. The bell chimed once as he passed through, and then he was gone. I stayed on the kitchen floor for another minute, waiting for my heart to slow down. When I finally stood up and looked through the window, the diner was empty. The money sat on the counter exactly where he'd left it. The spilled coffee was gone. The broken glass swept away. The kitchen door opened and I looked up to see Heather entering from the back prep area with a mop and a dustpan full of glass shards. "I heard the crash," she said simply. "Figured you might need a minute to collect yourself." "You broke the coffee pot," she said matter-of-factly. "I saw his hand was—" "I know." She walked past me to dump the glass in the trash. "I was watching through the service window. You looked. The rule said not to, but I couldn't help it. It was right there in my peripheral vision." Heather leaned the mop against the wall and turned to face me. "That's why the rule exists, because once you see it, you can't unsee it, and once you can't unsee it, things start getting complicated." What was he? The same thing they all are. Something that doesn't belong here, trying to fit into a shape that makes sense to us. She walked back toward the front, and I followed on unsteady legs. The old man routine is just camouflage, makes him seem harmless, non-threatening. But his hand was the part that couldn't maintain the illusion. That's why you don't look at it. Heather began wiping down the counter where he'd sat, her movements efficient and practiced. Looking directly breaks the spell, makes it harder for him to hold the shape. I sank onto one of the stools, my legs too shaky to hold me up. How do you know all this? Experience, observation, 3 years of following the rules and staying alive. She tossed the rag into the sink. You did good, though. You ran instead of staring. Some people get fascinated, try to understand what they're seeing. Those people don't last long. What happens to them? Heather was quiet for a moment, staring out at the empty parking lot. They start seeing things that aren't camouflaged, things that don't bother pretending to be human. The coffee maker gurgled as it finished brewing a fresh pot, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with that same whispered conversation sound. "How many rules are left?" I asked. 4 more tonight, then you get a break until tomorrow." I pulled out the laminated card and read through the remaining rules. Kitchen sounds at 3:55. Cheeseburger with no onions between 4:40 and 4:50. No sundresses after 4 hours. Phone call at 4:52. Do they all happen every night? Most nights. Sometimes the timing shifts by a few minutes. Sometimes one doesn't show up at all. But usually, she shrugged. Usually, they keep their schedule. Why? What's the point? Heather looked at me like I'd asked why water was wet. Same point as anything else, I guess. They exist, so they do what they do. We exist, so we follow the rules and try not to get in their way. She made it sound so simple, so matter-of-fact. Like serving coffee to things that weren't entirely human was just another part of the job description. Maybe it was. I looked around the diner again, seeing it with fresh eyes. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper now, more purposeful. The vintage decorations looked less like nostalgia and more like a stage set, props designed to make something unnatural feel familiar. "Heather? Yeah?" "When you said leaving stops being an option after you've been here long enough, what did you mean?" She was quiet for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I mean that after a while you realize the normal world was never really where you belonged anyway. And once you know that, once you really understand it. She met my eyes. Going back starts to feel like the scariest thing of all. The clock above the coffee maker ticked toward 3:55, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. 3 more rules to go. 3 more chances to break something I didn't understand and couldn't control. I tucked the card back under the register and tried to prepare myself for whatever was coming next. The money sat on the counter exactly where he'd left it. The spilled coffee pooled around the broken glass shards, dark liquid seeping between the fragments. Evidence of what had just happened. Maybe it was knowing what waited inside, or maybe the shadows between the pine trees really had gotten deeper. Either way, my hands shook as I turned off the engine. I looked up to see Heather entering from the back prep area with a mop and an empty dustpan. Methodical. The bell chimed when I pushed through the door, and a woman looked up from behind the counter. 50s, maybe, with gray blonde hair and a practical bob and the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd seen more than her share of late nights. She wore a navy cardigan over a white blouse, and everything about her screamed competent professional. "You must be Opal." Her voice carried the flat vowels of northern Minnesota. "Brenda Meyer, weekend night manager." She didn't offer a handshake, just studied me with the kind of assessment that made me feel like I was being measured for something. Her pale blue eyes missed nothing. The way I kept glancing toward the corners, how my shoulders stayed tense, the fact that I'd positioned myself within easy reach of the door. "Dan filled me in on your first few nights," she said. "Broke the first rule, almost broke the second. That about right?" Heat crept up my neck. "Heather helped me. Heather saved your life." Brenda's tone was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. "Question is, did you learn anything from it?" I pulled the laminated card from my pocket, the edges already starting to wear from handling. "I've been studying these." "Studying?" She almost smiled, but not in a way that made me feel better. "Honey, these aren't exam questions. They're survival instructions. Big difference." She walked me through the evening routine with the same methodical precision Dan had used. But where he'd been gentle, Brenda was blunt. Coffee stays fresh until midnight, then you brew a new pot. Pie case gets restocked at 11. Registered drawer gets counted at the end of shift, and it better match the receipts. "Most important thing," she said, wiping down the counter with sharp, efficient strokes, "is that you follow those rules exactly. Not approximately, not close enough, exactly." "I understand. Do you?" She stopped cleaning and fixed me with that penetrating stare. "Because we lost 3 employees last year who thought they understood. Smart people too, college kids like you, who figured they could improve on the system." My stomach clenched. "What happened to them?" "Nothing good." Brenda resumed her cleaning, but her movements had gotten harder, more aggressive. "Point is, these rules exist because someone before you made every possible mistake and paid for it. You want to survive this job, you follow them without question." The first few hours passed quietly. A trucker stopped for coffee and directions to Highway 2. An older man ordered pie and left exact change. Normal people doing normal things, but I found myself studying each customer's hands, their eyes, the way they moved through space. At 3:30, no one came. The clock ticked past 3:31, 3:32, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe the rules wouldn't. "Don't get comfortable," Brenda said without looking up from her crossword puzzle. "They don't always keep perfect time, but they always come." She was right. At 3:30, an elderly man shuffled through the door and ordered black coffee and a glazed donut. I served him with my eyes locked on his face, peripheral vision carefully controlled. He left at 3:40, and I didn't look at his left hand once. Progress. The clock crawled toward 3:55, and I felt that familiar tightness building in my chest. Rule 3. If you hear sounds from the kitchen, stand by the front entrance until 4:21 a.m. "Brenda?" "Yeah?" What exactly are we going to hear? She set down her pen and looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. Nothing you want to remember. At exactly 3:55, the kitchen door creaked open. Not the normal sound of someone pushing through. This was slow, deliberate, like something was testing the hinges. The creak stretched out for long seconds, metal against metal in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. Brenda stood up immediately and grabbed my hand. Her fingers were strong, calloused from years of work, and they gripped mine with surprising firmness. "Come on." She pulled me toward the front entrance, positioning us just inside the door with our backs to the windows. From here, I could see most of the diner, the counter, the booths, the entrance to the kitchen, but I couldn't see what was moving back there in the shadows. "Don't turn around," Brenda whispered. "Don't look back. Don't even think about it." The wet footsteps started a few seconds later. That's the only way I can describe them. Wet. Like someone walking through puddles. But the sound was wrong, too thick, too deliberate. Each step made a soft squelching noise that seemed to echo from inside my own skull. I bit down on my tongue to keep from turning around. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to understand what was making those sounds. But Brenda's hand squeezed mine in warning, and I forced myself to stare straight ahead at the empty diner. The footsteps moved from the kitchen into the main dining area. I could track their progress by sound, past the coffee station, around the counter, between the booths. Whatever was making them seemed to be exploring, taking its time to examine everything. Then came the breathing. Deep, labored inhalations that sounded like they were being drawn through water. Each breath was followed by a wet, rattling exhale that made my skin crawl. The sound moved around the diner with those same deliberate footsteps, sometimes close enough that I could feel displaced air against the back of my neck. Something knocked over a stack of plates near the coffee station. The crash echoed through the diner, followed by more of that waterlogged breathing. Then silence for maybe 30 seconds before the wet footsteps resumed. I don't know how long we stood there. Time seemed to stretch and compress around those sounds, making minutes feel like hours. My legs started to cramp from standing so still, but Brenda's grip never loosened, never let me forget that moving was not an option. More crashes from the kitchen, pots hitting the floor, cabinet doors slamming, the sound of running water. But underneath it all, that breathing continued, in through water, out through water, like something that had never learned to process air properly. At some point, the sound stopped, not gradually, just cut off between one breath and the next, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt solid. Brenda checked her watch. 4:21, she whispered. "We can go back now." She released my hand, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for the last several minutes. My lungs burned as I sucked in air, and my legs shook as we walked back toward the counter. The dining area looked normal. Chairs in their proper places, tables clean, everything exactly as we'd left it. But when we reached the kitchen door, Brenda paused. "You ready for this?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. She pushed open the door and we stepped into the kitchen. It was spotless, cleaner than it had been when we'd left it. The floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, every surface wiped down and sanitized. Even the pots that had crashed to the floor were back in their proper places, hanging from hooks above the prep station. But on the walls, at about shoulder height, were handprints. Wet handprints that gleamed under the lights like they'd just been made. They covered almost every surface, the walls, the refrigerator doors, the prep tables. But they weren't quite right. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow, and there were too many of them overlapping and crisscrossing in patterns that hurt to follow. "Don't touch them," Brenda said quietly. "They'll be gone by morning." I stared at the prints, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Some of them looked almost human. Others didn't. Like something had been experimenting with the concept of hands, trying to figure out how they should work. What was it? Something that doesn't belong here. Brenda walked past the handprints like they were just another part of the decor. Something that's trying to understand how our world works by touching everything in it. But why here? Why the diner? Brenda pulled 2 cups from the cabinet and started brewing fresh coffee. Her movements calm and practiced despite the impossible handprints covering the walls around her. You ever hear of Grayson Allen? I shook my head. He's the owner. Bought this place about 5 years ago, even though half the county tried to talk him out of it. She poured coffee into both cups, handed me one. See, strange things have always happened here, even before it was a diner, back when it was just a crossroads in the middle of nowhere. The coffee was strong, bitter, but it helped steady my nerves. What kind of strange things? People disappearing, lights in the forest that didn't belong to any campers, truckers reporting passengers who vanished between 1 mile marker and the next. Brenda leaned against the prep table, careful not to disturb the handprints. Local tribes used to avoid this area completely, called it a thin place. Thin, where the boundary between worlds gets stretched, where things can slip through that shouldn't be able to. She sipped her coffee, studying my face. Grayson's some kind of researcher, anthropologist maybe, or folklore specialist. Point is, he heard the stories and decided to investigate. So he bought a diner. He bought the land. The diner was already here. Been failing for years because no one could keep it staffed. Grayson figured if he was going to study whatever was happening, he needed a legitimate reason to be here all the time. I thought about Dan's careful rules, Heather's transformed understanding of reality, the way everyone seemed to accept the impossible as just another part of the job. And he pays people to work here knowing what they'll face? Triple minimum wage. Brenda's smile was grim. Plus health insurance, paid time off, and a retirement plan most people can only dream about. All you have to do is follow some simple rules and not ask too many questions. Most people can't handle it. Most people can't handle a lot of things. Doesn't mean the work doesn't need doing. She finished her coffee and rinsed the cup in the sink, careful not to disturb the handprints on the wall above it. Question is, can you? I looked around the kitchen, at the impossible handprints, at Brenda calmly cleaning up like this was the most normal thing in the world, at my own hands wrapped around a coffee cup in a place where reality worked differently than it was supposed to. I don't know. That's honest, at least. Brenda dried her hands on a towel. Most people who last more than a week give the same answer. The ones who think they know for sure, either way, usually don't make it through their first month. The rest of the shift passed quietly. A few more truckers, a woman in scrubs getting off a late shift, a guy who looked like he'd been driving for days. Normal people doing normal things while handprints that shouldn't exist slowly faded from the kitchen walls. When Dan arrived at 6 a.m., he took one look at the kitchen and nodded approvingly. "Clean night," he said. "That's good." Clean? I stared at him. There were handprints everywhere. But nothing was broken. No one got hurt. The sounds stayed in the kitchen where they belonged. Dan poured himself coffee, completely unbothered by the fading marks on the walls. Trust me, it could have been a lot worse. Brenda gathered her things, a large purse that seemed to contain everything anyone might need, a thermos, a paperback novel with a cracked spine. At the door, she paused and looked back at me. "You coming back tomorrow?" I thought about my student loans, my mother's medical bills, the crushing weight of having no other options. But also about Heather's words, how everything else would feel like pretending once you knew the truth. "Yeah, I'll be back." Brenda nodded. "Good. Maybe you'll be one of the ones who figures it out." Figures what out? How to stop asking why and start asking what comes next. She left me standing in a kitchen where impossible handprints were fading like morning mist, wondering if I was brave enough or desperate enough to find out what she meant. Maybe it was knowing what waited inside, or maybe the shadows between the pine trees really had gotten deeper. Either way, my hands shook as I turned off the engine. The bell chimed when I pushed Thar. I looked up to see a woman in a yellow sundress walking through the door, and my blood turned to ice water. The dress was sleeveless, made of thin cotton that would have been perfect for a July picnic. Except it was October in Minnesota, and the temperature outside was maybe 30 degrees. She looked normal otherwise, mid-30s, brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, the kind of smile that belonged on a kindergarten teacher. But that dress, that impossible, completely wrong dress. "Hi there," she said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. Her voice was cheerful, friendly. "Could I get a cheeseburger with no onions?" My hands went numb. Rule 4. If anyone asks for a cheeseburger with no onions between 4:40 and 4:50 a.m., tell them you cannot make that order and ask them to leave. It was 4:40 exactly. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "We can't make that order." Her smile flickered just for a second. "Oh, that's okay. I'm not picky about the onions. You can just pick them off." "No, I mean, we can't make that order at all. You need to leave." The smile disappeared completely. Her eyes, which had seemed brown a moment ago, were now a flat, colorless gray. "I'm hungry. I understand, but I'm very hungry." Her voice had changed, still hers but with something else underneath it, like an echo but the wrong way around. "I've been traveling for such a long time." I stepped backward toward the kitchen, my hand searching for the door. "I'm sorry, but you need to go. Why won't you feed me?" The echo in her voice was getting stronger, like multiple people speaking the same words at slightly different times. "I'm so hungry and I've been so good. I followed all the rules to get here. Please leave." She tilted her head and her neck bent at an angle that made my stomach lurch. "You're not being very nice. I just want something to eat. I can't. Feed me." The voice was definitely multiple now, overlapping and discordant. "Feed me." Her face began to stretch. Not like a person making an expression, like the skin itself was being pulled in directions it wasn't meant to go. Her mouth widened, corners extending past where her ears should be. Her eyes spread apart, migrating toward her temples while her nose flattened and disappeared entirely. I ran. The back door slammed behind me with enough force to rattle the frame. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. Through the small window, I could see her, or what she was becoming. Her body was expanding, growing taller and wider in ways that defied physics. The yellow sundress stretched with her, somehow accommodating a form that filled more and more of the diner's interior space. Her arms had become impossibly long, reaching across the room to touch walls that should have been 20 feet away. And that sound, that horrible, hungry sound that came from everywhere at once. "Hungry, so hungry. Why won't you feed me?" The voice shook the building. Coffee cups rattled on their hooks. The fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed like angry insects. Through the window, I watched her continue to grow, her transformed face pressing against the ceiling while her elongated limbs filled every corner of the dining room. I pressed my back against the door and slid down to the floor, knees pulled up to my chest. The sounds from inside were getting worse, not just her voice now, but the groaning of metal and wood as her expanding form pushed against the building's structure. Then, at exactly 4:55 a.m., 15 minutes after she'd arrived, everything went black. Not dark, black, like someone had turned off reality itself. The windows showed nothing but absolute void, as if the diner had been transported to the space between stars. The sound stopped. The rattling, the groaning, the horrible hungry voice, all of it cut off between 1 second and the next. I sat in that impossible darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My watch face glowed 4:58, then 4:59, then 5:1. At 5:01, light returned to the windows as suddenly as it had vanished. I waited another 10 minutes before I worked up the courage to look through the window again. The diner was empty. Completely, utterly normal. Chairs in their proper places, tables clean, coffee cups hanging neatly on their hooks. No sign that anything had happened. No evidence that a woman in a sundress had tried to eat me and then grown large enough to fill the entire building. I unlocked the door and stepped inside on unsteady legs. The air smelled like pine trees and old coffee. Normal diner smells. Nothing lingered of whatever had been here 15 minutes ago. The bell chimed at 5:15 a.m., and I nearly jumped out of my skin. A man walked in wearing an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with dark hair and sharp features that belonged in a magazine ad for luxury watches. Everything about him screamed money and education, from his perfectly styled hair to his Italian leather shoes. Opal, I presume. His voice carried the kind of cultured accent that suggested private schools and Ivy League universities. I'm Grayson Allen, the owner, the man who'd bought this place knowing what happened here, who paid people triple minimum wage to follow impossible rules and serve coffee to things that weren't entirely human. How am I settling in? He asked, sliding onto the same stool where the woman in the sundress had sat 20 minutes earlier. I stared at him, rage building in my chest like a pressure cooker about to explode. What the hell is going on here? His smile was sad, almost apologetic. Ah, you've had your first real encounter. That woman, thing, whatever she was, she tried to eat me. She grew until she filled the entire diner, and then everything went black. And now you're asking how I'm settling in like this is some kind of normal job orientation. Grayson nodded thoughtfully, like I'd just described a minor scheduling conflict. The sundress entity. Yes, she's particularly unsettling. Most people find her more disturbing than the others. Most people? My voice cracked. How many people have you put through this? More than I'd like. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a silver business card case, extracting a card with the same careful precision he probably used for everything, but fewer than the situation requires. I didn't take the card. Answer my question. What is this place? Grayson set the card on the counter between us and leaned back slightly, studying me with eyes that seemed older than his face. The diner sits on what you might call a weak point, a place where the boundary between our reality and somewhere else has worn thin. Somewhere else? I don't have a name for it. Neither does anyone else, as far as I know. It's not heaven or hell or any kind of afterlife. It's just other. A place where different rules apply, where consciousness takes different forms. I thought about the man with the too wide smile, the elderly man whose left hand wasn't entirely human, the wet footsteps in the kitchen, the woman who'd grown large enough to fill a building. The things that show up here, they're from this other place? Some of them. Others are caught between, existing partially in both realities. Grayson's expression grew more serious. They're not evil, Opal. They're just not compatible with our world. Like trying to run software designed for one operating system on completely different hardware. And the rules? Keep the boundary intact. Prevent catastrophic incompatibilities. He gestured around the empty diner. Think of this place as a kind of buffer zone, a controlled environment where limited contact can occur without destabilizing either reality. I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. You bought a diner to study interdimensional entities. I bought the land because strange things were already happening here. The diner was just the most practical way to maintain a presence and gather data. His smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Plus, it turns out that serving coffee and pie creates a remarkably stable framework for supernatural encounters. And you pay people to work here knowing they'll face this. I pay people very well to work here knowing they'll face this. he corrected. Triple minimum wage, full benefits, hazard pay, and a retirement package that most Fortune 500 companies can't match. Because you're asking them to risk their lives. Because I'm asking them to risk their humanity. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. The people who last here, who really adapt to the work, they change. Heather, Brenda, Dan, they're not entirely human anymore. The exposure, the constant contact with the boundary, it transforms them. I thought about Heather's 2 quick movements, the way she seemed to know things before they happened, Brenda's unnatural calm in the face of impossible situations, Dan's careful rules and practiced acceptance of the unacceptable. What kind of transformation? Enhanced perception, ability to sense supernatural activity before it manifests, resistance to reality distortions. Grayson's voice was clinical, like he was reading from a research paper. But also, progressive detachment from normal human experience. They can still pass for human in casual interactions, but they no longer fully belong to our reality. And you think that's acceptable? I think it's necessary. His calm facade cracked slightly, revealing something desperate underneath. The boundary is weakening, Opal. The encounters are becoming more frequent, more intense. Something is building toward a convergence, and when it happens, we need people who can function in both realities. I looked around the diner again, seeing it differently now. Not just a restaurant in the middle of nowhere, but a research station, a watchtower, a place where someone was trying to understand forces that could reshape the world. Why are you telling me this? Because you've survived 4 encounters in 3 nights. Because you follow the rules even when they don't make sense. Because you're asking the right questions. Grayson leaned forward, his gray-green eyes intense. And because I think you already know you're not going to leave. He was right, and I hated him for it. I thought about my student loans, my mother's medical bills, the crushing weight of having no other options. But also about Heather's words, how everything else would feel like pretending once you knew the truth. What happens if I stay? You learn to navigate between worlds. You help maintain the boundary that keeps both realities stable. You become part of something larger than yourself. His voice softened. And you never have to worry about money again. And if I leave, you go back to your old life with a story no one will believe and memories that will haunt you forever. He stood up, straightening his expensive suit. The choice is yours, Opal, but I suspect you've already made it. He walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. The rules card you've been carrying. There's a phone number on the back. Call it if you decide to stay. We'll discuss your permanent position. The bell chimed as he left, and I was alone again in the diner that wasn't really a diner. I pulled out the laminated card and flipped it over. A phone number was printed in the same courier font as the rules, along with a single line of text. When you're ready to understand what comes next. I stared at the card for a long time, thinking about impossible choices and the price of survival. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Normal people would be waking up soon, getting ready for normal jobs in a normal world that suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper. I picked up the phone and dialed the number. The bell chimed at exactly 4:52 a.m. I looked up from wiping down the counter and my blood went cold. A man stood in the doorway, average height, maybe 40, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit that looked expensive enough to feed a family for months. Everything about him seemed normal, except for his eyes. They were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire visible eye, like looking into deep space. "Opal Howell," he said, and his voice carried no accent, no regional markers. It could have belonged to anyone from anywhere. "May I come in?" I gripped the rag tighter. "We're open." He stepped inside with movements that seemed too smooth, like he was gliding rather than walking. The fluorescent lights caught his face as he approached the counter, revealing features that were handsome in a way that felt artificial. Too symmetrical, too perfect. "You've had quite an eventful few nights," he said, settling onto a stool with the kind of fluid grace that made my skin crawl. "4 encounters in 3 shifts. That's unusual." "I don't know what you're talking about." His smile was patient, understanding. The man who couldn't blink, the elderly gentleman with the interesting left hand, the sounds in the kitchen, the woman in the sundress who was so very hungry. He tilted his head. "Shall I continue?" My mouth went dry. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been watching. Someone who's concerned about how quickly you've adapted to seeing things that shouldn't exist." Those black eyes studied me with an intensity that made me want to hide. Most people who survive their first encounter either quit immediately or spend weeks in denial. You served coffee to impossibility and came back the next night. The kitchen door swung open and Heather appeared. She moved toward us with that same efficient grace I'd grown used to, but something was different. Her dark eyes met mine for just a second, and in that instant, they went completely black. The same endless void as the man's, before returning to their normal brown. I stumbled backward, knocking over the coffee pot behind me. It hit the floor with a crash that echoed through the empty diner. "Ah," the gray-suited man said softly. "You're beginning to understand." The front door opened, though I hadn't heard the bell chime. Brenda walked in wearing the same navy cardigan she'd had on when she left hours ago, but her movements were wrong, like someone had edited out random frames from a film, making her appear to skip across space in stuttering jumps. "We need to talk," Brenda said, her voice layered with harmonics that hadn't been there before. I pressed my back against the coffee station, looking between the 3 of them. Heather, with her occasionally black eyes, Brenda moving in ways that defied physics, the gray-suited man who'd somehow known my name and everything that had happened to me. "What are you?" I whispered. "We're what this place makes of people who stay long enough," Heather said. Her voice was still her own, but underneath it was something else, like an echo from a very,